Ever feel like you're going through life with like the wrong instruction manual? You know, like everybody else knows this secret about how to act and how to be successful, especially,
Yeah,
and you never got the memo.
right.
Well, we are diving deep into Susan Cain's book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, to uncover the often unsung strengths of us quieter types.
It's so interesting that you say that because one of the things that Cain does so well is she really flips the script on what we think of as success, especially in Western cultures.
hmm
This idea that to be successful, you have to be the loudest one in the room.
Yeah, it's like everybody read How to Win Friends and Influence People, and that's
Uh-huh.
the only thing that matters.
Yeah, and she talks about this shift from what she calls a culture of character to a culture of personality. You think about somebody like Abraham Lincoln, who's revered for his honesty, for his integrity,
Right.
not necessarily, his charm.
His ability to work a room, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then somewhere along the line, we started to really prioritize that outward-facing charisma, sometimes at the expense of substance.
So it's not about who you are, it's about how well you can perform it.
Precisely. And this extrovert ideal, as
Mhm.
she calls it, it isn't just some abstract concept.
Mm-hmm.
She takes us to places like Harvard Business School,
Oh, wow.
where class participation and, networking are like the keys to success.
Oh, yeah.
And so she really makes us think about what's it like for somebody who really thrives in quiet contemplation, to be thrust into an environment that rewards the most outspoken voices.
It's almost like we're telling introverts, if you could just be more like these other people, then you would be successful.
Exactly.
And I think that that's why it's so refreshing when she talks about all these amazing leaders who are introverts, people like Rosa Parks. Talk about quiet strength, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
She didn't need to shout and be the loudest voice in the room. Her simple act of resistance really sparked a movement.
Right.
And then you've got Steve Wozniak, the tech genius behind Apple. I mean, imagine if he felt like he constantly had to be the life of the party.
Right.
He probably wouldn't have had the time or the mental space to invent, what he did.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, like, how much innovation are we missing out on
Oh, big.
just by valuing one certain type of leadership style?
This is why I find the research on level 5 leaders so interesting. Have you heard about this?
Stuff, yeah.
Jim Collins found that often it was the quiet, unassuming CEOs that led the most profitable companies. So it wasn't about, being the big, charismatic leader. It was more about their quiet determination.
Right, their focus.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So if introversion can be such an asset, where does it even come from? Is it nature? Is it nurture? It's got to be some sort of combination.
Right.
Well, Cain digs into the science behind this, and it's pretty fascinating.
It is, yeah.
This is where I get excited. Okay, so I remember when I was reading the book, she was talking about high reactivity in children
Mm-hmm.
and something about, some babies just being more sensitive to their surroundings than others.
Yeah, you're right. You're remembering correctly. Psychologist Jerome Kagan, he discovered that those babies who are really easily startled by new sights, new sounds, things like that,
Mm-hmm.
they often grew up to be more introverted.
Interesting.
So it's like their nervous systems are just wired for this.
Interesting. So like a classroom that might feel very, very stimulating or exciting for one child might feel completely overwhelming to another child.
Exactly. And Cain even takes it a step further and connects this to the amygdala,
Yeah.
which is the part of the brain that processes fear.
Wait, the fear center of the brain.
Yeah.
So are you telling me that for some people walking into a party or like a networking event, it's almost like they're walking into like, I don't know, a lion's den or something?
In a way, yes. Because brain scans actually show that introverts' amygdalas, they tend to be more reactive in social situations, even when those situations are totally harmless.
Interesting.
It's like their brains are just interpreting these encounters with a heightened sense of alertness.
Oh, I see why she talks about the importance of restorative niches. Like if you're constantly feeling like you're on edge, you've got to have somewhere to go to unwind and recharge.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding burnout.
Yeah.
These quiet periods are where introverts do their best work.
Yeah.
That's when they're able to really focus and think deeply and solve problems.
It's not that one is better than the other. It's that different temperaments thrive in different settings.
Exactly.
And I think that's where we can start to unpack the real power of introversion.
Right.
It's not about being shy. It's not about being afraid to talk to people. It's really about having a different set of strengths that when recognized and supported can lead to some pretty remarkable things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, we've talked about how introverts' brains are kind of wired for sensitivity, but how does that translate into, like, actual strengths?
Right.
Because you could see how in a world that really values charisma and, being quick on your feet, that sensitivity might be seen as a weakness.
Yeah, and Cain really challenges that perception by talking about the work of Elaine Aron,
Uh-huh.
who's done a lot of research on high sensitivity.
Okay, yeah, high sensitivity. Remind me what that's all about. It's like those people who pick up on those little details
Yes.
that everybody else seems to miss.
Exactly.
Like they notice everything.
Yeah, they're more tuned into subtleties in their environment, in their conversations, in
Hmm.
art, in everything. Yeah.
And that can be overwhelming, I imagine, but what's the upside?
Right. Well, think about empathy, for example.
Yeah.
That ability to really understand and share somebody else's feelings.
Yeah.
And because highly sensitive people are so tuned into those emotional cues, they're often really good at connecting with others on a deeper level.
It's one thing to like notice it,
Right.
but it's another to actually like understand why that matters.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just, interpersonal relationships.
Okay.
It can also be a catalyst for some amazing creativity and problem solving. Because they're processing information on such a deep level, they often will see patterns and make connections that other people might miss.
So they're almost like seeing an extra layer to
Exactly.
the situation.
And this leads us to one of, I think, the most practical and empowering concepts in the book. Professor Brian Little's idea of free trade agreements.
Oh, yes. This is one of my favorites. Free trade agreements.
Yeah.
This is like our permission slip
Right.
to be strategically out of character when we need to be.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, let's say you're dreading a big networking event for work.
Oh, yeah.
And as an introvert, that might sound kind of scary.
Oh, yeah, the worst.
But instead of trying to force yourself to be on the entire time,
Right.
you can make a free trade agreement with yourself
Yeah.
where you say, you know what, I'm going to talk to 3 new people.
You set a small, achievable goal,
Exactly.
and then you give yourself permission to, like, go hide in the bathroom for 20 minutes.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is it works both ways, right?
Okay.
So extroverts can use it too.
Oh, I never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
So if you're naturally really outgoing
Uh-huh.
and you've got to, like, sit down and do your taxes or something.
Right. Something that requires a lot of focus.
You're like, okay, for the next 3 hours, I am putting my phone away. I'm not checking my emails.
Right. You're going to act introverted for a little while.
That's so interesting. So it's not about like changing who you are.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we all have all of those capabilities within us.
Exactly. And it's about being strategic about when and how we use them.
This makes me think about how much of this whole introvert-extrovert thing is also influenced by, how we grow up, our
Right.
culture, the expectations that are kind of put on us from a young
It's
age.
huge, yeah.
Does Cain talk about that at all?
She does, yeah. She dives into how those cultural norms really shape how we think about introversion and extroversion.
Mm-hmm.
What might be seen as thoughtful in one culture could be seen as, shy or timid in another culture.
It's almost like we're all swimming in this, like, cultural water, and
Right.
we don't even realize how much it's influencing us.
And she gives the example of, contrasting Western cultures,
Mm.
which often emphasize self-promotion,
Mm.
being really assertive,
Right.
with East Asian cultures, where humility and quiet strength are often seen as more valuable.
So there are cultures where being like the quiet achiever,
Yeah?
that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, it's celebrated.
Huh. That's a nice thought.
Yeah, and imagine, think about somebody who is raised in a culture where quiet contemplation is valued, indirect communication is valued,
Mm.
and then they're kind of thrust into a Western workplace where it's all about speaking up and networking.
Yeah, it's like suddenly their strengths are almost a liability because
Right.
it's a whole different way of like seeing the world.
Right, and that's why Cain's message, I think, is so important.
Mhm.
It's not about, one way of being is inherently better than another. It's really about broadening our understanding of success
Yeah.
and creating a world where everyone can thrive.
It's like we're missing out on all these different ways of being. And speaking of missing out, I know that Cain also challenges kind of our traditional idea of what it means to be powerful. Like she talks about soft power, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And she contrasts, the Western emphasis on, really bold, decisive leadership
Mm-hmm.
with kind of this more Eastern approach of, leading by water instead of by fire.
And she talks about Gandhi as an example of that.
Exactly,
How,
yeah.
like, he was this incredibly effective leader, but it wasn't about, like, you know, dominating people with his personality. It was more about his message
Right.
and his ability to kind of inspire others to get on board.
It really makes you rethink all those, like, classic images we have in our heads of what a powerful leader is supposed to look like.
Totally. Yeah, maybe it's not always about being the loudest one in the room.
Right.
So if we want to actually, like, put this into practice, how do we move beyond just like acknowledging these differences and actually start creating environments where everybody can thrive?
Well, Cain gives some really practical advice, I think, and it really applies to so many different areas of life. How we raise and educate our children,
Yeah.
how we structure our workplace.
How we interact with each other on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
I know she talked a lot about, with kids especially who are introverted, it's so important for them to have that time and space to recharge.
Yes, especially in school settings where they're constantly bombarded with stimulation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about like, you know, giving them a quiet room to go to. It's also about really honoring their interests.
Right.
Because a lot of times as introverted kids, they have these really deep passions.
Yeah.
And they might be really into something that's like kind of quirky or different. Like
Yeah.
maybe they're obsessed with dinosaurs or they love building things.
Right. And instead of seeing that as like, oh, that's weird or that's different, seeing it as like, wow, this kid could really be onto something.
It could be a sign of like a really powerful intellect.
Exactly. And Cain encourages parents and teachers to celebrate those interests,
Totally.
to really nurture that kind of curiosity and that love of learning.
And this goes for workplaces too, right? Like we can't just keep shoving everybody into these open office plans and expect them to do their best work.
Yeah, I mean, her research shows pretty clearly that introverts do their best work when they have the time and space to really concentrate.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to collaborate with others. It's just that the collaboration might look a little different.
Right.
So it's more about recognizing that everybody has different needs and different ways of working,
Yeah,
and that those differences can actually be a real strength
absolutely.
if we, know how to tap into them.
It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued for who they are
Yeah.
and not pressured to, like, conform to some external ideal.
And I think that's a really powerful message that Cain leaves us with. It's not about like, introverts versus extroverts. It's about creating a world that works for everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, or somewhere in between, I think we can all get behind that. Well, that's it for our deep dive into quiet. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Be sure to let us know your thoughts on this, and as always, happy reading.